The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like a shroud, as if the very air understood the weight of the day ahead. Prince William stood at the tall window of his private chambers, watching the groundskeepers make their final preparations in the quadrangle below. Their movements were precise, respectful, each step measured against the gravity of what was to come. In a few hours, they would lay to rest a man who had been the backbone of the royal family for over 7 decades. William's fingers traced the edge of the funeral order of service that lay on the mahogany desk beside him. The crisp, white paper felt heavier than it should, each printed word a reminder that Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was truly gone. The man who had taught him to shoot, who had shared countless stories of naval adventures, who had been a constant presence at family gatherings with his sharp wit and unwavering devotion to duty, would soon be nothing more than memories preserved in the hearts of those who loved him. The Prince of Wales adjusted his military uniform for the 3rd time, the familiar weight of his medals providing little comfort. He had worn this uniform to many state occasions, but today felt different. Today, the pomp and ceremony would serve a deeper purpose than protocol. It would honor a man who had sacrificed his own ambitions to support the crown, who had walked 2 steps behind the Queen for decades without ever seeking the spotlight for himself. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Catherine entered quietly, her black dress elegant in its simplicity, her presence immediately bringing a sense of calm to the room. She had been his anchor through many difficult moments, and today would be no exception. Her eyes, filled with understanding and compassion, met his across the room. "The children are asking about their great-grandfather again," she said softly, moving to stand beside him at the window. "George wants to know if Gone will be sad today." William nodded, thinking of their eldest son's innocent question. How do you explain death to a child? How do you make them understand that someone who seemed so permanent, so enduring, could simply be gone? Prince Philip had been a fixture in their lives, always present at Christmas gatherings, always ready with a story or a gentle tease for his great-grandchildren. "What did you tell him?" William asked, his voice carrying the weight of a father trying to navigate uncharted waters. "That we're saying goodbye to someone very special, and that it's okay to feel sad. That Gone needs us to be strong today, just like great-grandfather would want." Catherine's hand found his, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become second nature over their years together. Outside, the sound of vehicles arriving could be heard faintly through the thick walls of the castle. Family members, dignitaries, and officials were beginning to gather for what would be an intimate affair by royal standards. The pandemic had forced them to scale back the ceremony dramatically, limiting attendance to just 30 people. In some ways, William thought, Philip would have preferred it this way. He had never been one for excessive fanfare, despite spending his life at the center of it. The prince's thoughts drifted to the complex dynamics that would play out today. Family tensions that had simmered beneath the surface for months would need to be set aside in favor of collective grief and respect for the man they were honoring. His relationship with his younger brother had been strained, words spoken in anger and frustration creating a chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing month. Harry would be there today, having flown back from California specifically for the funeral. It would be the first time they had been in the same room since their grandfather's death, the first opportunity to perhaps begin healing the wounds that had divided them. William felt a familiar knot in his stomach when he thought about his brother, a mixture of love, frustration, and sadness that he couldn't quite untangle. Catherine seemed to sense his thoughts, as she so often did. "He loved you both equally," she said quietly. "Today isn't about anything else but that." She was right, of course. Prince Philip had been a grandfather in the truest sense, never playing favorites, always treating both princes with the same combination of affection and expectation. He had been proud of William's dedication to duty, but he had also celebrated Harry's military service and his work with veterans. To Philip, family meant loyalty, support, and putting personal differences aside when it mattered most. The morning progressed with the mechanical precision that such events required. Staff members moved through the castle like ghosts, ensuring every detail was perfect while maintaining the subdued atmosphere that grief demanded. William found himself checking his watch repeatedly, not because he was eager for the day to end, but because time seemed to move differently when you were preparing to say goodbye to someone irreplaceable. A text message from his private secretary reminded him of the final briefing before the service. There would be specific protocols to follow, positions to maintain, and ceremonial elements that had been practiced and rehearsed. But underneath all the formal structure lay the simple reality that they were a family mourning the loss of their patriarch. As he prepared to leave his chambers, William caught sight of himself in the mirror. The reflection showed a man in his late 30s, bearing the weight of future kingship on his shoulders, but also someone who was simply a grandson missing his grandfather. The uniform, the titles, the protocols, they were all part of who he was, but today they felt like armor protecting him from the raw emotion of loss. The walk to the briefing room took him through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors who had faced their own moments of grief and loss. The monarchy had endured for over 1,000 years, sustained through wars, scandals, and personal tragedies by the simple act of putting duty before personal feelings. Today would be another test of that principle, another moment when the institution would need to demonstrate its resilience while honoring the memory of one of its most devoted servants. In the briefing room, other family members were gathering, their faces reflecting the same mixture of sadness and determination that William felt. The Queen sat with remarkable composure, dressed in black but maintaining the dignity that had defined her long reign. At 94, she was saying goodbye to the man who had been her constant companion for over 70 years. Yet she showed no sign of the devastating personal loss she must have been experiencing. The final preparations were reviewed with military precision. The route from the castle to St. George's Chapel, the order of procession, the timing of each element. Every detail had been planned and practiced. William listened carefully, knowing that his role today was not just as a grandson, but as a senior member of the royal family who would need to help guide the ceremony with dignity and respect. As the briefing concluded, William felt a familiar sense of duty settling over him like a mantle. This was what he had been born for, trained for, prepared for throughout his entire life. The ability to function with grace under pressure, to put the needs of the institution and the family above his own emotional needs, to be a source of strength when strength was required. The moment was approaching when they would need to take their places, when the private grief would become public ceremony, when the family would step forward to honor a man whose life had been dedicated to service. William straightened his shoulders, drew a deep breath, and prepared to do what his grandfather would have expected of him, to serve with dignity, honor, and unwavering commitment to duty. The chapel bells began their solemn toll as the funeral procession formed in the castle courtyard. William took his designated position, feeling the cool April air against his face and the weight of centuries of tradition settling around him like a familiar coat. To his right stood his father, Prince Charles, whose face bore the particular gravity of a son preparing to bury his father. The pain was visible despite years of royal training in emotional restraint. Behind them, family members arranged themselves according to protocol that had been established generations ago, each person knowing exactly where they belonged in this carefully choreographed expression of grief and respect. The Land Rover Defender, specially modified according to Prince Philip's own specifications, waited to carry the coffin. Even in death, the Duke's practical nature and attention to detail remained evident. William scanned the assembled group and spotted Harry standing with their cousins, his military uniform pristine despite the long journey from California. Their eyes met briefly across the courtyard, a moment of acknowledgement that carried the weight of shared history and current estrangement. Harry's face was composed, professional, but William could see the tension in his brother's shoulders, the way he held himself slightly apart from the others. The sight of his younger brother brought a flood of memories rushing back. Christmases at Sandringham when they were children, racing through the corridors while Prince Philip pretended to be annoyed, but secretly smiled at their energy. Summer holidays at Balmoral, where their grandfather taught them to fish and shared stories of his own childhood adventures. The old man had always treated them as individuals, never as spare and heir, but simply as his grandsons who needed guidance, discipline, and unconditional love. The processional music began, and the family fell in a step behind the Land Rover as it made its slow journey towards St. George's Chapel. William found his stride, matching the measured pace, his mind shifting into the focused state that royal duties required. Around them, castle staff and officials stood at attention, their faces reflecting the same mixture of sadness and respect that permeated the entire day. The chapel came into view, its ancient stones weathered by centuries of royal ceremonies, baptisms, weddings, and funerals. Today it would witness the final farewell to a man who had been christened there as an infant and who had returned countless times over the decades for family occasions both joyous and solemn. The building itself seemed to understand the significance of the moment, its Gothic architecture reaching toward heaven as if offering prayers on behalf of those gathered below. As they approached the chapel steps, William could see the carefully arranged seating inside. The pandemic restrictions meant that family members would be seated apart, each in their own space to maintain safety protocols. It would make the ceremony feel even more intimate, each person alone with their thoughts and memories while sharing in the collective act of mourning. The Queen walked ahead of them, her pace steady despite her advanced age and the emotional weight of the day. She had insisted on being present for every aspect of the funeral, refusing to delegate this final act of love and respect to others. William admired her strength, knowing that she was drawing on reserves of courage that had sustained her through 7 decades of public service and personal challenge. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere was reverent and peaceful. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the stone floor and illuminating the simple floral arrangements that decorated the altar. Prince Philip had requested a military funeral rather than a state funeral, preferring the straightforward dignity of his naval service to the elaborate pageantry of his royal position. William took his assigned seat, noting that Harry was positioned several rows behind him, separated by both physical distance and the complex family dynamics that had evolved over the past year. The seating arrangement had been planned months in advance, based on royal protocol and practical considerations, but it felt symbolic of the emotional distance that had grown between the brothers. The service began with the Archbishop of Canterbury's measured words, offering comfort and hope while acknowledging the depth of loss felt by all present. William listened to the familiar prayers and hymns, finding solace in the ancient rhythms of faith that had sustained his family through countless generations. The chapel's acoustics carried every word clearly, creating an atmosphere of shared reverence that transcended individual grief. When the time came for the reading of Prince Philip's naval prayer, William felt his composure waver slightly. The words spoke of service, duty, and dedication to something greater than oneself, principles that had guided his grandfather's entire life, and that now challenged William to carry forward the same commitment to service. The prayer was a reminder that true leadership meant sacrifice, putting the needs of others before personal desires. The Dean of Windsor's eulogy painted a picture of a man who had dedicated his life to supporting others, who had found fulfillment not in personal glory, but in enabling his wife to fulfill her destiny as queen, and in preparing future generations to serve with the same dedication. Philip's life had been a masterclass in duty, loyalty, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing your purpose and pursuing it without wavering. As the service progressed, William found his thoughts turning to the lessons his grandfather had taught him, both directly and through example. The importance of preparation, the value of hard work, the necessity of putting duty before personal preference. These were not just royal obligations, but fundamental principles for living a meaningful life. Philip had never preached these lessons. He had simply lived them every day for nearly a century. The military honors that followed were precisely executed, each element a tribute to Prince Philip's naval career and his role as Captain General of the Royal Marines. The sound of the last post echoed through the chapel, its haunting melody a final salute to a man who had served his country and his family with unwavering commitment. William felt the music reaching into his chest, awakening emotions that he had carefully controlled throughout the morning. The Queen sat alone in the front row, a small figure in black bearing the weight of personal loss while maintaining the dignity that her position demanded. Her solitude was both heartbreaking and inspiring, a reminder of the sacrifices that royal duty required and the strength that came from a lifetime of service to others. She had lost her husband, her closest advisor, and her most trusted companion, yet she remained present and composed for the sake of her family and her people. As the service approached its conclusion, William prepared himself for the moment that would follow, the family's departure from the chapel, and the beginning of the healing process that would need to occur in the weeks and months ahead. The funeral would end, but the task of processing grief and rebuilding family relationships would continue long after the cameras stopped filming and the public attention moved elsewhere. The final prayers were offered with particular reverence, each word chosen to provide comfort while acknowledging the reality of loss. William joined his voice with the others in the chapel, finding strength in the collective act of worship and remembrance. The ceremony was drawing to a close, but the memory of this moment would remain with all of them forever. A time when personal differences were set aside in favor of shared love and respect for an extraordinary man who had devoted his life to serving others with grace, humor, and unwavering dedication. The service concluded with a blessing, and the family began their solemn departure from the chapel. William rose from his seat, his legs stiff from the formal posture he had maintained throughout the ceremony. The weight of the morning's emotions seemed to settle deeper into his bones with each movement, but he maintained the composure that years of royal training had instilled in him. As they filed out of the chapel, following the prescribed order of precedence, William found himself walking just ahead of Harry. For the first time in months, they were sharing the same physical space, breathing the same air, united in their grief for the grandfather who had meant so much to both of them. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words, months of hurt feelings, and the complicated love that exists between brothers who have traveled different paths. The April sunshine felt warm against their faces as they emerged from the chapel, a stark contrast to the cool, reverent atmosphere inside. William could hear the faint sound of photographers capturing images of this historic moment, but his attention was focused on the immediate reality of walking beside family members who were all processing their own versions of loss and remembrance. Catherine appeared at his side as they made their way back toward the castle, her presence providing the steady support that had become so essential to his life. She understood the complexity of royal obligations better than most, having learned to navigate the delicate balance between public duty and private emotion. Her hand briefly touched his arm, a gesture of comfort that no one else would notice, but that meant everything to him in that moment. The Queen walked ahead of them with remarkable dignity, her small frame somehow commanding the respect and attention of everyone present. At 94, having just buried her husband of 73 years, she continued to demonstrate the strength and grace that had defined her reign. William marveled at her composure while recognizing the profound loss she was experiencing behind her composed exterior. As they approached the castle entrance, the formal processional began to dissolve into smaller family groups. It was in this transitional moment that William became aware of Harry walking nearby, no longer bound by the strict protocols that had governed their positions during the service. For the first time in months, there were simply two brothers who had just attended their grandfather's funeral. The conversation began naturally, almost unconsciously. Perhaps it was the emotional weight of the day, or the shared memories of their grandfather, or simply the recognition that some moments are too important for personal grievances. William found himself turning toward Harry, and His brother responded with the same instinct. He would have been proud of the service, William said quietly, his voice carrying both sadness and appreciation for the dignity of the ceremony they had just witnessed. Harry nodded, his expression softening slightly. Remember how he always complained about long services? He would have appreciated that they kept it simple. There was a hint of a smile in Harry's voice, a memory of their grandfather's practical nature, and his occasional impatience with excessive ceremony. They walked together naturally, their steps falling into a rhythm that had been established decades ago during countless family walks at Balmoral, Sandringham, and Windsor. Despite the months of tension and distance, their bodies remembered how to move together, how to share space without awkwardness. The muscle memory of brotherhood proved stronger than the recent conflicts that had divided them. Other family members seemed to sense that something significant was happening between the two princes. Conversations continued around them, but there was an awareness that this moment between the brothers was important, perhaps even historic. Peter Phillips, their cousin, had been walking between them initially, but naturally stepped aside to allow them the space they seemed to need. William noticed that Harry looked tired, the strain of recent months evident in the lines around his eyes and the tension in his posture. The move to California, the public interviews, the media scrutiny. It had all taken a toll that was visible despite his brother's attempt to maintain royal composure. But there was also something else in Harry's face, a vulnerability that reminded William of the younger brother who had once looked up to him for guidance and protection. "How are you holding up?" William asked, the question carrying layers of meaning beyond simple concern about the day's emotional challenges. It was perhaps the first time in months that he had spoken to Harry with genuine care rather than formal politeness or frustrated anger. Harry's response came slowly, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "It's been difficult," he admitted, "being away from family during this time, missing the last few months with him. I keep thinking about things I wanted to say to him, conversations we might have had." The honesty in Harry's voice created an opening that William hadn't expected. For months, their communications had been filtered through staff, formal statements, or carefully crafted public appearances. This was the first time they had spoken directly about anything meaningful since the tensions had escalated to the point where normal family relationships became impossible. "He knew you loved him," William offered, remembering their grandfather's pride in both of his grandsons despite his concern about the family divisions. Prince Philip had never taken sides in the conflicts, maintaining his affection for both brothers while hoping that time and wisdom would heal their relationship. He used to talk about your military service, your work with wounded veterans. He was proud of what you accomplished. They had reached a quiet courtyard within the castle grounds, away from a main group and the cameras that had documented every moment of the public ceremony. Here, surrounded by ancient stone walls and centuries of royal history, the two brothers found themselves in their first private conversation in over a year. The silence between them was different now, less hostile and more contemplative. Both men seemed to be processing not just the day's events, but the larger questions about family, duty, and the path forward. The funeral had reminded them both of what really mattered, the bonds of love and loyalty that transcend disagreements and misunderstandings. Catherine and the other family members had continued toward the castle, giving the brothers the privacy they seemed to need. It was an intuitive gesture of support, recognizing that some conversations cannot be scheduled or managed, but must happen naturally when the moment is right. Harry broke the silence first. "I've been thinking about when we were kids, those summers at Balmoral. Remember how grandfather used to take us fishing, and he'd tell us stories about the war while we waited for the fish to bite?" William smiled at the memory. He always said that patience was the most important thing you could learn from fishing. That and the ability to stay quiet when necessary. The recollection brought warmth to his voice, a reminder of simpler times when their biggest concern was whether they would catch enough fish to impress their grandfather. "I miss those days," Harry said quietly. "I miss a lot of things about how we used to be." The admission hung in air between them, heavy with implications and possibilities. It was perhaps the closest either brother had come to acknowledging that their current estrangement was causing them both pain, that the cost of their disagreements was higher than either of them wanted to admit. William felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the tension and anger that he had carried for months. Looking at Harry in this moment, grieving, vulnerable, clearly struggling with his own choices and their consequences, he saw not the brother who had caused him frustration and disappointment, but the person who had shared his childhood, who understood the unique challenges of their position in ways that no one else ever could. "Today isn't about us," William said finally, "but maybe we can find a way to talk. Maybe we owe it to his memory to try." Harry's response was immediate and heartfelt. "I'd like that. I'd really like that." The two brothers stood together in the quiet courtyard for several more minutes, neither seeming eager to break the fragile connection that had been re-established between them. The ancient stones around them had witnessed countless royal dramas over the centuries, reconciliations and conflicts, moments of triumph, and periods of crisis. Today, they were silent witnesses to what might prove to be the beginning of healing between two men whose relationship had become symbolic of larger questions about family, duty, and the modern monarchy. William found himself studying his brother's face, noting changes that months of separation had prevented him from observing. Harry looked older, more weathered by recent experiences, but also somehow more grounded, as if the challenges he had faced had forced him to develop new sources of inner strength. The move to California, the decision to step back from royal duties, the intense media scrutiny, all of it had clearly taken a toll, but it had also revealed a determination in Harry that reminded William of their grandfather's resilience. "Walk with me," William suggested, gesturing toward a path that would take them through the castle gardens. It was a route they had traveled countless times as children, racing through the carefully maintained flower beds while their protection officers struggled to keep up. Today, their pace was measured and thoughtful, two adults processing grief and possibility in equal measure. As they walked, Harry began to speak about his life in California, not defensively or with the careful PR language that had characterized his recent public statements, but with the honest vulnerability that had once been natural between them. He talked about the challenges of adapting to a new country, the pressure of building a new life while maintaining some connection to the family and traditions that had shaped him. "It's been harder than I expected," Harry admitted. "Not the practical things, those you can figure out, but being away from everything familiar, especially during times like this. When someone you love dies, you want to be with the people who knew them the way you did, who share the same memories." William listened without judgment, recognizing the courage it took for his brother to acknowledge difficulties after such a public and definitive break with royal life. The admission created space for empathy, allowing William to see past his own hurt feelings to the genuine struggles his brother was experiencing. "Grandfather worried about you," William said gently, not in a critical way, but the way he worried about all of us when we were facing challenges. He wanted you to be happy, but he also wanted you to find a way to stay connected to the family. The revelation seemed to affect Harry deeply. For months, he had been portrayed in the media as someone who had rejected his family entirely, who had chosen celebrity and financial independence over duty and tradition. To learn that his grandfather's final months had been marked by concern rather than anger was clearly meaningful to him. "I never wanted to cause him pain," Harry said quietly. "I know it probably seemed that way, with all the public statements and interviews, but I was trying to protect my own family, trying to create a safe space for them. I didn't know how to do that while staying within the system that felt so constraining." William nodded, recognizing the complexity of his brother's situation, even as he continued to disagree with some of the choices Harry had made. The challenge of being a younger son in the royal family was something he had observed, but never experienced personally. Harry had always been the spare, the backup plan, the one whose life was constrained by royal protocol, but who would never have the clear sense of purpose that came with knowing you would one day be king. They had reached a bench beneath an old oak tree, a spot where they had often sat as children when they needed to escape the formal atmosphere of the castle. Without discussion, Both brothers settled onto the weathered wood, their formal military uniforms a stark contrast to the casual summer clothes they had worn during countless childhood conversations in this same spot. "I've made mistakes," Harry continued, his voice gaining strength as he found his footing in this unfamiliar territory of honest communication with his brother. "Some of the things I said publicly, the way I handled certain situations, I know they hurt you, and I know they hurt the family. I was angry, and I let that anger guide decisions that I should have thought through more carefully." The apology was unexpected and clearly heartfelt. William felt some of the tension he had been carrying for months begin to ease, replaced by a familiar protective instinct toward his younger brother. Despite everything that had happened, despite the public controversies and private disappointments, Harry was still the person who had walked beside him at their mother's funeral, who had shared the unique burden of growing up in the public eye under impossible circumstances. "I haven't been perfect either," William admitted. "I could have tried harder to understand your perspective, could have been more supportive when you were struggling. I think I got caught up in protecting the institution and forgot that I was also supposed to protect my brother." The mutual acknowledgement of mistakes created a foundation for something neither brother had dared hope for during the long months of estrangement. Not a return to the way things used to be, too much had changed for that, but perhaps a path toward a relationship that could accommodate their different choices while preserving their love for each other. Catherine appeared at the edge of the garden, clearly checking on William while respecting the privacy of their conversation. She caught his eye and gestured subtly, indicating that the family gathering was continuing inside, but that there was no immediate pressure for them to return. Her understanding of royal protocol and family dynamics allowed her to create space for what was happening between the brothers while ensuring that other obligations were managed appropriately. "She's been worried about this situation," William told Harry, following his brother's gaze toward Catherine. "About us, about the family, about how all of this was affecting everyone. She's always believed that family relationships are worth fighting for, even when they're complicated." Harry smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of warmth William had seen from him all day. "She's been good for you, and good for the family. I'm glad you found someone who understands what all of this requires." The acknowledgement meant more to William than he had expected. Harry's approval of his marriage and his wife had never been in question, but hearing it expressed directly, especially in the context of their current conversation, felt like a bridge being rebuilt between their present circumstances and their shared future. "Your children," William said, shifting the conversation towards safer but equally important ground. "Grandfather would have loved to see them grow up, to share some of his stories with them. Maybe there's a way to make sure they know about him, about this part of their heritage, even from a distance." Harry's face brightened at the mention of his children, and for the first time all day, he looked completely relaxed. "They're amazing," he said simply. "And you're right, they should know their great-grandfather's stories, should understand where they come from. That's part of what I've been trying to figure out, how to give them a connection to their history while protecting them from some of the pressures that come with it." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the gravel path. Prince Charles appeared, walking slowly but purposefully toward his sons. His face was etched with the grief of the day, but also showed something that might have been relief as he observed the two brothers sitting together, talking with an ease that had been absent for far too long. "Your grandmother is asking for the family," Charles said gently. "But take your time. This conversation is important too." The intervention was perfectly timed and sensitively handled, acknowledging both the formal requirements of the day and the personal healing that was taking place. Charles had watched his son's relationship deteriorate with the same pain that any father would feel, knowing that some wounds could only be healed by the brothers themselves, but hoping for exactly this kind of opportunity. William and Harry exchanged a look that communicated volumes, gratitude for this unexpected gift of honest conversation, hope that it might continue, and recognition that they needed to return to their family responsibilities while the foundation they had just laid was still fragile and new. The three men walked back toward the castle together, Charles between his sons in a formation that felt both natural and symbolic. For the first time in over a year, The immediate royal family was moving as a unit, united by grief, but also by the possibility of healing that had emerged from their shared sorrow. The formal reception following the funeral would require them to interact with other family members and officials, but this private moment of reconciliation had created a foundation that might support more substantial conversations in the days ahead. Inside the castle, the queen sat in the oak drawing room, surrounded by close family members who had remained after the service. Despite the emotional weight of the day, she maintained her characteristic composure while clearly drawing comfort from the presence of her children and grandchildren. When William and Harry entered together, she looked up with an expression that registered both surprise and quiet satisfaction. She had witnessed decades of family conflicts and reconciliations, and her experience had taught her to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when healing was beginning. "Boys," she said simply, using the same affectionate term she had employed when they were children racing through these same rooms. The word carried no reference to their recent difficulties, no acknowledgement of the months of tension that had kept them apart. Instead, it was an invitation back into the family circle, a reminder that their places at her side were permanent regardless of the paths their lives had taken. Harry approached his grandmother with visible emotion, bending to kiss her cheek in a gesture that was both formal and deeply personal. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here more during his final months," he said quietly, his voice thick with regret and love. The Queen's response was characteristically direct and compassionate. "He knew you loved him, dear. That was never in question. What matters now is that we support each other through this difficult time and honor his memory by taking care of the family he devoted his life to protecting." The wisdom in her words seemed to settle over the room, providing guidance not just for Harry, but for everyone present. Prince Philip had indeed spent 7 decades nurturing and protecting his family, often putting their needs above his own preferences and ambitions. His legacy wasn't just his personal achievements, but the strong foundation he had helped create for future generations to build upon. William watched his brother's interaction with their grandmother and felt a surge of protective love that reminded him of their childhood dynamic. Despite everything that had happened, despite the public controversies and private disappointments, Harry was still his little brother, still someone who needed support and understanding rather than judgment and criticism. The realization shifted something fundamental in William's perspective, replacing months of frustration with renewed commitment to their relationship. The afternoon progressed with quiet conversations and shared memories, family members taking turns to share stories about Prince Philip that highlighted different aspects of his character. His sense of humor, his practical approach to problem-solving, his unwavering support for environmental causes, his dedication to youth development programs. Each remembrance added another layer to the portrait of a man whose influence had extended far beyond his royal duties. Catherine moved through the room with her characteristic grace, ensuring that conversations flowed naturally while providing subtle support to family members who were struggling with their emotions. Her presence had become invaluable during family gatherings, offering a perspective that was both inside and outside the royal system. She understood the pressures and protocols but hadn't been born into them, giving her a unique ability to bridge different viewpoints and facilitate understanding. As the official reception began to wind down, William found himself standing near the window with Harry, both brothers looking out over the grounds where they had spent so many hours of their childhood. The gardens were showing the first signs of spring, with daffodils blooming beneath trees that were just beginning to show new green leaves. The cycle of renewal was visible everywhere, a reminder that growth and change were natural parts of life, even in an institution as tradition-bound as the monarchy. "This doesn't solve everything," William said quietly, acknowledging the reality that one afternoon of honest conversation couldn't undo months of hurt feelings and public controversy. "We still have a lot to work through, and we're still going to disagree about some fundamental things." Harry nodded, appreciating his brother's honesty. "I know, but maybe we can find a way to disagree without being enemies." maybe we can remember that we're family first, even when we can't agree on everything else. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their cousins, Peter and Zara Phillips, who had been waiting patiently for an opportunity to spend time with both brothers. Their presence brought a different energy to the group, the easy camaraderie of the younger generation who had grown up together and maintained close relationships despite the pressures of royal life. "Remember grandfather's stories about learning to fly?" Zara asked, settling into a chair near the window. "He always said that the most important thing was learning to trust your instruments, even when your instincts told you something different." The memory sparked a conversation about Prince Philip's various adventures and interests, from his naval career to his passion for carriage driving. The stories revealed a man who had never stopped learning, never stopped challenging himself to try new things despite the constraints of his position. His curiosity and energy had been infectious, inspiring all of his grandchildren to pursue their own interests with similar enthusiasm. As evening approached, practical considerations began to intrude on the emotional atmosphere. Harry's flight back to California was scheduled for the following day, and there were logistics to arrange, security briefings to complete, and final farewells to be organized. The temporary bubble of family intimacy that had surrounded the funeral would soon give way to the realities of their very different lives. William found himself reluctant to let the day end, knowing that it might be months before another opportunity for such honest conversation arose. The demands of his royal schedule, combined with Harry's commitments in California, would make regular communication challenging even if both brothers were committed to maintaining their renewed connection. "We should stay in touch," William said as they prepared to leave the drawing room. "Not through staff or official channels, but directly. Even if it's just checking in occasionally, making sure we're both okay." Harry's agreement was immediate and heartfelt. "I'd like that. And maybe when things settle down a bit, there could be opportunities for the children to know each other. They're cousins, after all. They should have that connection, even if everything else is complicated." The mention of their children brought both hope and complexity to the conversation. William's 3 children were being raised within the royal system, with all the privileges and pressures that entailed. Harry's children would grow up with a very different relationship to their royal heritage, but they were still part of the family lineage that Prince Philip had worked so hard to preserve and strengthen. As the family began to disperse, each member processing the day's events in their own way, William and Harry found themselves alone once more. The formal portraits had been taken, the official obligations had been fulfilled, and the public aspects of the funeral were complete. What remained was the private work of grief and healing that would continue long after the media attention faded. "Thank you," Harry said simply, the words encompassing gratitude for the conversation, for his brother's willingness to listen, and for the possibility of a path forward that neither of them had imagined when the day began. William's response came from the heart. He would have wanted this. Not the drama, not the public arguments, but us talking, trying to understand each other, putting family first. Maybe that's the best way to honor his memory. As they walked toward the castle entrance where cars waited to take them to their respective accommodations, both brothers carried with them the sense that something significant had shifted. The problems that had driven them apart hadn't disappeared, and the challenges of rebuilding their relationship while living very different lives remained substantial. But the foundation laid by shared grief and mutual love had proven strong enough to support honest conversation and genuine reconciliation. The funeral of Prince Philip would be remembered as a moment when the royal family demonstrated dignity and unity in the face of loss. For William and Harry, it would also be remembered as the day they began to find their way back to each other, guided by the memory of a grandfather who had loved them both unconditionally and who had spent his final years hoping that love would eventually overcome the differences that had divided them. In choosing to walk together from the chapel, they had taken the first step on a journey that would require patience, forgiveness, and commitment from both brothers, but that held the promise of healing not just their relationship, but their understanding of what family truly means.